People's experiences in school and education are distinctly unique. I'm sure everyone watching this video can look back on their K through 12 experiences and envision the good, the bad, and the unrelenting social anxiety you always felt before a presentation. However, while we are in school, hardly any of us are aware of the social and historical effects that surround our schools. Things like religion, gender, and differences in wealth had significant seen and unseen effects on shaping our schooling experiences. Maybe you went to a Christian or Catholic school, or even an all boys or an all girls school. Or you simply attended the local public school system, like myself. Still, these differences in schools come with a significant difference in resources, teaching, and attitudes that directly affect how students interact and are interacted with by their schools. One of the most impactful factors in the experience of schooling that I have yet to mention is race. Now, before some of you assume that the color of our skin couldn't have affected our schooling experience because you don't see color or your school is diverse, I ask that you just wait and give me some time. Roll the clip.
I just told you I don't see color. I see people for who they are the exact same way I see you.
If you don't see my blackness, you don't see me.
If you haven't seen this movie, The Hate U Give, the girl who drops this bar is named Star. That sounded way better in my notes. Anyway, in this scene, her boyfriend is trying to understand her perspective as a black person in the US. I want you viewers to see this clip because it highlights a critical mindset that exists in a lot of Americans, that being colorblindness. Colorblindness is an attitude that chooses to, quote unquote, ignore race to promote fairness and equality. However, America today and America of the past have and probably always will be a racialized country. So when Star, in this clip, says, "If you don't see blackness, you don't see me," preach girl. Her words hit hard because her boyfriend's willful blindness to race invalidates the history and current circumstances of race relations in America, the good and the bad. And before we get too far into this, no, I am not only accusing white people of this mindset. This mindset does exist across many different races in America. I know this because I am a black person who once actively tried to hold this colorblind narrative, which was a really confusing time in my life. I want to apply to these rigorous Ivy Plus schools. I believe that the academic environment is ideal for my goals in life. That's ambitious for someone like you. Someone like me. What does that mean? Well, you're just, you know, I am a person just like everyone else, and I believe I can fit in at any college. Well, I just don't think you fit the demographics. How about community college? Oh. I bring this little skit up to exaggerate, my colorblindness in, past times, specifically when I was applying to colleges. I really thought that my race didn't have an impact in these situations, and that was my own colorblindness. Now, whether you or I recognize it or not, race has dramatically shaped the opportunities within our school systems. It is easy to believe that schools level the playing field for everyone. However, a part of breaking out of our colorblindness and being aware of how race affects schooling is recognizing that the U.S. we have today is not free from the history of racism. Therefore, the school systems are not free from that racist history either, which is especially apparent when discussing the relationships between blackness and education. Since elementary school, we've been taught the basics of African American history in social studies and related history classes. From slavery to the Civil War, maybe even a little bit about Reconstruction if your school was feeling particularly empowered, followed by a touch about segregation and Jim Crow laws, then of course the Civil Rights Movement, where after everyone lived happily ever after. You know, the absolute bare bones basics. However, even with our totally inclusive and transparent learning of African American history, we hardly discuss and are aware of how race and racism impacted education for Black Americans during these schools. I'm sure, for the most part, we are all aware of what segregation looked like before the 1960s, and if you aren't, please do history. It's just important common knowledge. However, still, we don't often consider the mindsets of the people in power, which were white Americans who created a racist and segregated America. Today, most of us have a hard time understanding why a person would treat someone so horribly because of another person's skin, at least most of us. But we don't consider that these attitudes have existed for longer than they haven't. Unlike modern day, Americans and much of the white Western world before the 1950s and 60s viewed the other races as biologically inferior. This perspective on race can be seen in the literature of elite academics, mostly European, from that time, as many held the beliefs that other races were inferior to the supreme race of whiteness, i.e., white supremacy. This attitude and dehumanization allowed for slavery and other atrocities to be explainable. They even created a whole science on the differences and inferiorities between races called eugenics. If you've never heard of it, don't worry, you'll probably learn about it in the next Joe Rogan podcast. All jokes aside, it was easy for many white Americans at the time to reason that teaching black people to read, write, and be educated was a waste of time, and investing in education and the communities for black Americans was not valuable. Hence, black Americans found themselves economically behind their white peers, but also, of course, educationally. There were few to no opportunities for African Americans to learn, and when they finally had some access to education, it was vastly inferior to that of white students. The framing of black people as being biologically inferior and that mindset being discussed and accepted widely allowed for America to be unapologetically racist and prevent students from having the basic opportunities that we see in our schools today. People's beliefs of black Americans being genetically inferior gave grounded reasoning for their lack of economic and educational success. However, as years rolled on, and with the efforts of many black Americans like Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells, some guy who had a nice dream, and many other black and white Americans, racism slowly became unpopular, and mindsets based on white supremacy and eugenics were erased under the ruling in Brown v. Board and the Civil Rights Act. Right? Unfortunately not. In came two very important studies, which gave people evidence for a new type of racist reasoning. The first report is the Moynihan Report, released in 1965. In this report, the author, Moynihan, makes claims that black poverty comes from familial and cultural troubles, not structural and historical racism. Single mother households were at the center of this argument. This report allowed for the blaming of black cultural traits rather than addressing continued discriminatory practices like housing policies, unfair arrest rates, and underfunding of schools. The second report, called the Coleman Report from 1966, actually had good data that highlighted how external structures affected achievement in schooling more than any other factor, and that black and white students were receiving vastly different education experiences even when attending similar schools. Unfortunately, people have been taking stats out of the whole context to support their agendas. And in this situation, racist ideals took the report as further confirmation that racial disparities reflect inherent or cultural differences rather than school inequality. I hate all black people. They are inferior to my whiteness. Hey, that's wrong, and you shouldn't say things like that. I actually don't hate black people. I just believe that their inability to be successful is from their improper attitudes and behaviors within their family and social structures. Therefore, I think they shouldn't be seen in my schools and communities because they would hinder my ability to be successful. At least until they are qualified enough to share the same spaces as me. Oh yeah, that is a totally reasonable take. The mindset that came following these two reports is called cultural deprivation. And essentially, it's instead of explaining racist behaviors and views of inferiority through the genetic side, the new age of racism explained itself through the color of the mind. What I mean by this is that instead of pinning the blame on simply the color of the skin, racists were now blaming the mental state of culture and behavior in black communities, seeing it as morally and culturally lacking in comparison to white society. This mindset of cultural deprivation seeped into the school systems that we now have today, which in many ways continues to impact the black community. Black students often have lower academic expectations from their teachers when compared to their white peers. They are often labeled as in need of special education far more than white students, and also, black students are unfairly disciplined. They will be labeled as disruptive, rude, and defiant, whereas the white students are just curious and enthusiastic. For example, I once had a white friend who openly asked my seventh grade math teacher about her sex life with her husband, and everyone in the class laughed, including the teacher. But if I did that, I would have gotten detention, and the teacher probably would have reported me for sexual harassment. As a matter of fact, another time in my schooling experience, after the first time I got pulled over and had my car unlawfully searched by the police, another story for a different day, the school resource officer pulled me into his office the next day saying that he had saw my name in the police logs and was questioning me about what had happened. And then after we had discussed the situation, he decided to exclaim that this meeting was not about race. And then he sent me on my merry way. When I had told my white friends about this following it, they were like, that's never happened to us before, and we've been pulled over. And I bring these stories up to say that even though my school resource officer and many people exclaimed that the issues with black communities is not about race, it is. It's always been about race. America has been an incredibly racist society since its creation, and the schools reflect that broader society. It is an undeniable fact that racism has never disappeared. It has instead reformed into this mindset that black people are culturally and academically deficient. People who take on this cultural deprivation mindset say that the black community doesn't care about education, their parents don't support them, they are wild and misbehaved. However, not many people stop and ask themselves about what is causing this gap between black and white society. The new form of racism allows people to not question whether or not black communities are receiving the same amount of funding, instruction, and curricula in schools. People consciously or subconsciously ignore the overcrowding of schools, housing policies, environmental stress, and so much more because it requires America to take responsibility for the past. Think about the media we consume today. Phrases like black fatigue that blow up on TikTok and Instagram and other social media platforms encapsulate the deficit thinking. There is apparently a tiredness of the misbehavior and attitudes in the black community, but yet this tiredness and these attitudes towards the black community don't consider why some of these behaviors exist in black culture. I could make a whole video alone on my experiences and how often I was viewed as deficient in comparison to my white peers, but I am one of the 48 million black individuals in the US, and my experiences are not unique and have been shaped by a long and continued history of racism. Therefore, as students in schools, we should not ignore our peers' race. Let us not be colorblind. Instead, be aware of how our race directly interacts and shapes our experiences. With awareness comes our God-given ability to have empathy, and with empathy comes support for change. Education should be an equal and equitable opportunity for all. And inequality in education for any race of American is an injustice that many of us partake in through our complacency. So let us not be scared of the conversation about race and its history in the education system, but let us become more aware of it.